to the series of A-level past paper discussions. In this video, I will be discussing the first 25 MCQs in the A-level 2016 biology paper. So let's start with the first question. Which of the following organelles in plant cells converts fats into carbohydrates? Lysosomes, peroxisomes, glyoxysomes, endoplasmic reticulum, and Golgi complex. Let's first look at the functions of each of these organelles. So the first organelle is lysosomes. Now, lysosomes are round vesicles containing digestive enzymes, and they are involved in intracellular digestion of ingested phagocytic material, digestion of worn out cellular organelles by a process called autophagy, and they can also cause cellular death by spilling the enzymatic contents into the cytoplasm, causing cell death, which is known as autolysis. And the next organelle is peroxisomes. Now, peroxisomes are round vesicles similar to lysosomes, but the function of peroxisomes will be detoxification of peroxides. It will be easy to remember. The function of peroxisomes is detoxification of peroxides. In addition, peroxisomes are also found in plant cells. In plant cells, the function of peroxisomes is photorespiration. The third organelle is glyoxysomes. Now, glyoxysome is an organelle that is present only in plant cells. In plant cells also, glyoxysomes are found in the lipid-rich plant seeds. Now, the function of glyoxysomes here is to convert the lipids in these plant seeds into carbohydrates, so that the growing embryo can utilize these soluble carbohydrates for its growth. And the fourth organelle given is endoplasmic reticulum. We know that there are two types of endoplasmic reticulum present in a cell: rough endoplasmic reticulum and the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. The rough endoplasmic reticulum is involved in transporting proteins within the cell that are produced by the ribosomes on its surface, while the smooth endoplasmic reticulum is involved in synthesizing carbohydrates, synthesizing lipids including steroids, detoxification, and also involved in storage of calcium ions. And the fifth organelle given is Golgi complex. The Golgi complex is involved in synthesizing complex carbohydrates. In addition, the Golgi complex also will pack these complex substances like glycoproteins and glycolipids by budding vesicles from its cisternae and transporting these vesicles within the cell. So now coming back to our question, they are asking the organelle that converts fats into carbohydrates. So now we have discussed the functions of all these five organelles, and now we know that the organelle that converts fats into carbohydrates out of these five given organelles is glyoxysomes. So the answer is statement 3, glyoxysomes. Question number 2. Which of the following is correct regarding prokaryotic organisms? Now, who are prokaryotic organisms? These are the organisms who do not have a true nucleus, meaning that their nuclear material is not surrounded by a proper nuclear membrane. And also these organisms don't have any membrane-bound organelles. The only organelle that is present in these organisms would be ribosomes. Examples for prokaryotic organisms would be bacteria and archaea. Let's look at the first statement. The first statement says that all prokaryotic organisms are heterotrophic. Now, heterotrophic organisms are the organisms who do not produce their own food and who depend on other organisms. But we know that some of the bacteria are photosynthetic. They can produce their own food, and therefore they are autotrophic. So not all prokaryotic organisms are heterotrophic, and therefore this statement is false. The second statement says that all prokaryotic organisms do not have peptidoglycan in their cell walls. We know that all bacteria have peptidoglycan in their cell walls, both gram-positive as well as gram-negative bacteria. But archaeans do not have peptidoglycan in their cell walls. So not all prokaryotic organisms have peptidoglycan in their cell walls, and this statement is therefore true. The third statement says that all prokaryotic organisms can fix atmospheric nitrogen. If you consider bacteria, there are only some bacteria that can fix atmospheric nitrogen. Not all bacteria can fix atmospheric nitrogen. So not all prokaryotic organisms will fix atmospheric nitrogen. So this statement is false. Fourth statement, all prokaryotic organisms do not have ribosomes. We know that the only organelle present in prokaryotic organisms is ribosomes because they don't have any other membrane bound organelles. So this statement is false. Number 5, all prokaryotic organisms are not microorganisms. This statement is also false because both bacteria and archaea, who are the only prokaryotic organisms, they are all microorganisms. The correct statement is going to be the second statement. MCQ number 3, the base adenine of DNA of an organism forms 23.3% of its composition. Which of the following is the most likely base composition of its DNA? Now we know that the base adenine forms 2 bonds with the base thymine, and the base guanine will form 3 bonds with the base cytosine. So the total number of bases of adenine will be equal to the total number of thymine bases, and the total number of guanine bases will be equal to the total number of cytosine bases. And now we are given the composition of adenine bases in the DNA sample, which is 23.3%. So the composition of thymine bases in the sample also has to be 23.3%. Then the addition of the compositions of adenine and thymine bases will be twice this value, which will be 46.6%. Then the rest of the DNA sample should contain guanine and cytosine bases. Now the rest of the composition will be equal to 100 minus 46.6%, which will be 53.4%. This is the addition of guanine and cytosine bases. Since guanine and cytosine bases are also going to be the same in this DNA sample, we can divide this value by 2 to get the composition of each of guanine and cytosine, which is going to be 26.7%. So out of the given 5 statements, the correct answer will be the third statement, which says that adenine is equal to thymine, which is 23.3%, and guanine equals cytosine, which is 26.7%. MCQ number 4, which of the following structure function combinations is incorrect? Now note that here they are asking for the incorrect statement. The first statement says that the nucleolus is involved in ribosome production. This statement is correct. In fact, the nucleolus is involved in synthesizing ribosomal RNA or rRNA and assembling this rRNA and proteins to form ribosomal subunits. So the first statement is true. Second statement says glycosomes involved in photorespiration in plants. Now in our first MCQ, we already said that it's peroxisomes that are involved in photorespiration in plants, not glycosomes. So the second statement is incorrect. Third statement, cytoskeleton determines the shape of the cell. This statement is also true. Cytoskeleton is in fact involved in determining the shape of the cell. In addition, cytoskeleton is also involved in transporting nuclear material within the cell during nuclear division, and is also involved in transporting lysosomes within the cell. The fourth statement, vacuoles store soluble substances needed for cellular activities. This statement is also true. Vacuoles are like storage bags within the cell cytoplasm, and they store soluble substances like water, ions, minerals, and sucrose. In statement 5, Golgi complex produce lysosomes. This statement is also true. We said that the Golgi complex will synthesize complex substances like glycoproteins and glycolipids and will pack these substances by budding vesicles from its cisternae. And these budding vesicles from its cisternae will be transported within the cell as lysosomes. So out of these 5 statements, the incorrect statement will be statement number 2. Question number 5. Which of the following is common to lactic acid fermentation, alcoholic fermentation, and aerobic respiration? Now, before going on to the statements, let us first look at what happens in these three processes. During the metabolism of glucose, whether or not oxygen is present, glucose will be converted to pyruvate by a process called glycolysis. And after conversion of glucose into pyruvate, if oxygen is present, this pyruvate will undergo aerobic respiration to produce carbon dioxide and water. And if oxygen is not present, this pyruvate will undergo fermentation. The products of fermentation will differ in plants and animals. In plants as well as in yeast, fermentation is going to produce alcohol, that is ethanol and carbon dioxide, while in animals, fermentation is going to produce lactate. Now we can see that the common step that is seen in all these three processes, lactic acid fermentation, alcoholic fermentation, and aerobic respiration, will be glycolysis, which will be the first statement. So the answer is first statement, glycolysis. Question number 6. Which of the comparisons between C3 and C4 photosynthesis in plants is incorrect? Before going on to the statements, let us first briefly see what is going to happen in C3 pathway and C4 pathway of photosynthesis. This slide shows you the C3 pathway of carbon dioxide fixation. Now in the C3 pathway of carbon dioxide fixation, the main carbon dioxide acceptor is a 5-carbon compound called RUBP. And RUBP, after accepting carbon dioxide, will be converted into a 6-carbon compound by the enzyme RUBP carboxylase. And this 6-carbon compound is highly unstable and it will immediately break down into 2 molecules of a 3-carbon compound called PGA, or phosphoglyceric acid. And this phosphoglyceric acid will be used to regenerate RUBP. And the reason why this pathway is called C3 pathway is because the first stable product that is formed in this pathway is a 3-carbon compound called phosphoglyceric acid. Let's now look at the C4 pathway of carbon dioxide fixation. Here, 2 cells are involved in carbon dioxide fixation, the mesophyll cell and the bundle sheath cell. And the first carbon dioxide fixation occurs in the mesophyll cell. Here, the main carbon dioxide acceptor will be phosphoenol pyruvate, or PEP, which is a 3-carbon compound. So carbon dioxide is accepted by phosphoenol pyruvate, and this is going to produce a 4-carbon compound called oxaloacetic acid. And this conversion is catalyzed by the enzyme PEP carboxylase. And the reason why this pathway is called C4 pathway is because the first stable product that is produced in this pathway is a 4-carbon compound called oxaloacetic acid. Now let us go through the statements given. The first statement says that in C3 pathway, carbon dioxide fixation occurs only once. This is true. In C4 pathway, carbon dioxide fixation occurs twice. This is also true. The first carbon dioxide fixation occurs in the cytoplasm of mesophyll cell, while the second carbon dioxide fixation occurs in the stroma of the bundle sheath cell chloroplast. Again, in this diagram, you can see that after forming oxaloacetic acid in the mesophyll cell cytoplasm, this oxaloacetic acid will be converted into malate by using NADPH that is produced in the mesophyll cell chloroplast during the light reactions. And this malate is then going to enter the bundle sheath cell chloroplast, and in the stroma of the chloroplast, malate will be converted to pyruvate. In this process, carbon dioxide and NADPH will be released, and this carbon dioxide will be then fixed by RUBP, which is the second carbon dioxide acceptor in this pathway. Then the pyruvate that is produced will be the again diffused into the mesophyll cell, and in the mesophyll cell cytoplasm, pyruvate is used to regenerate phosphoenol pyruvate using ATP that is produced in the mesophyll cell chloroplast using the light reactions. Now the second statement says that in C3 pathway, major carbon dioxide acceptor is RUBP. This is true. And in C4 pathway, the major carbon dioxide acceptor is phosphoenol pyruvate. This is also true. Third statement, C3 pathway, carbon dioxide fixing enzyme is RUBP carboxylase. When C4 pathway, carbon dioxide fixing enzyme is PEP carboxylase. These two statements are also true. The fourth statement, in C3 pathway, photosynthetic yield is high. In C4 pathway, photosynthetic yield is low. This statement is false. In fact, the photosynthetic yield is high in C4 pathway and the photosynthetic yield is low in C3 pathway. And having a low photosynthetic yield in C3 pathway is the reason why some plants have adopted different mechanism for carbon dioxide fixation, which is C4 pathway. In C3 pathway, the carbon dioxide fixing enzyme, that is RUBP carboxylase, has a low affinity for carbon dioxide. So when the carbon dioxide concentration decrease and when the oxygen concentration increase, the RUBP carboxylase can oxidize RUBP instead of carboxylating RUBP. Now if RUBP is oxidized, the resultant product is going to be a 5-carbon compound, and this 5-carbon compound can then produce only one molecule of PGA or phosphoglyceric acid. This is in contrast to the 2 molecules of PGA that are produced when RUBP is carboxylated. So now we know that oxidation of RUBP is going to decrease the production of PGA by exactly half than when RUBP is carboxylated. So that is why in C3 pathway of carbon dioxide fixation, when the carbon dioxide concentration is low and when the oxygen concentration is high, the photosynthetic yield is going to be reduced by half. To prevent this problem, in C4 plants, the oxygen producing light reactions occur in mesophyll cells, while the carbon dioxide fixing dark reactions occur in the bundle sheath cells. So RUBP is not oxidized. In addition, the first carbon dioxide acceptor in C4 pathway, which is PEP carboxylase, this enzyme has a very high affinity to carbon dioxide and it will carboxylate phosphoenol pyruvate even when the carbon dioxide concentration is low. So this is how C4 plants have adopted a different pathway for carbon dioxide fixation to increase the photosynthetic yield. Let's go to the fifth statement. It says that the C3 pathway, first product of photosynthesis is phosphoglyceric acid. In C4 pathway, the first product of photosynthesis is oxaloacetate. This statement is also true. Now when we look at all our 5 statements, the incorrect statement is going to be statement number 4. Question number 7. One characteristic of each of the organisms labeled as A, B, C and D is as follows. Heterosporous gametophyte is photosynthetic, seedless, thalloid gametophyte. Now they are asking the organisms in A, B, C and D in the correct order. Before going on to the statements, let's briefly look at the classification of plants. As shown in this chart, plants can be broadly classified as non-vascular plants and vascular plants. Non-vascular plants are the plants that have not differentiated into roots, stems and leaves. Examples for non-vascular plants would be liverworts and mosses. Markantia is an example for a liverwort and Pogonatum is an example for a moss. Coming to vascular plants can be again classified as seedless plants and seed-bearing plants. Examples for seedless plants would be lycophytes and pterophytes or ferns. Selaginella and Lycopodium are examples for lycophytes. Nephrolepis is an example for a pterophyte or a fern. Seed-bearing plants can be again classified as gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms are the plants that produce naked seeds, meaning that the seeds are not covered within a fruit. Examples for gymnosperms would be cycas and pinus. Angiosperms are the plants that produce covered seeds. Now here the seeds will be present inside a fruit, so they are covered. And angiosperms are also known as flowering plants. And again, these plants can be classified as monocotyledons and dicotyledons. We all know the differences and the characteristics of monocotyledons and dicotyledons. Now let us look at the characteristics that are given. Heterosporous. Heterosporous plants are the plants that produce two types of spores. They can produce microspores as well as megaspores. Now, microspores give rise to a male gametophyte, while the megaspores will give rise to a female gametophytes. In this diagram, I have circled the plants that are heterosporous. Now, all the seed-bearing plants are heterosporous plants, both gymnosperms and angiosperms. Out of the seedless plants, most of them are homosporous. Only a few of the seedless plants are heterosporous. Out of the examples given here, Selaginella will be a heterosporous plant. Among non-vascular plants, again mosses are heterosporous plants. Let's have a look at the 5 statements given here. We will go through the first response given in each of these 5 statements. Now, cycas and pinus, these two plants are seed-bearing plants and are gymnosperms. And now we know that all the gymnosperms and angiosperms are heterosporous. So, cycas and pinus will be true. Then, mango and banana. They are also heterosporous plants since they are seed-bearing plants and are angiosperms. Then, fifth statement, we have pogonatum. Now, pogonatum is an example for a moss, and we said that pogonatum is also an example for a heterosporous plants. So, the first responses in all 5 statements are going to be true. Now, the second characteristic is gametophyte is photosynthetic. We know that plants have a haplodiploid life cycle, which means that their life cycle is going to alternate between a haploid gametophytic stage and a diploid sporophytic stage. And the cells in both these two stages can divide by mitosis. Now, if we look at our classification, the most primitive plants like the non-vascular plants such as mosses and liverworts, the dominant stage is going to be the haploid gametophytic stage. So the gametophytes will be independent and therefore they can photosynthesize, while the diploid sporophyte is going to depend on this gametophyte. So the gametophytes of primitive plants like non-vascular plants are going to be photosynthetic. When we look at the other extremity, the seed-bearing plants, they are the most advanced plants. Here the sporophytic stage is going to be prominent, and the gametophyte is going to depend on the sporophyte. Therefore, the gametophyte will not be photosynthetic in seed-bearing plants. Now, when we look at the seedless plants, both the gametophytic and the sporophytic stages are going to be independent of each other. So, both these two stages can photosynthesize. So, in overall, the gametophyte is going to be photosynthetic in non-vascular plants like liverworts and mosses, and seedless plants like lycophytes and pterophytes. Let's have a look at the second responses in all 5 statements. Marchantia. Now we know that Marchantia is an example for a liverwort. So they have a photosynthetic gametophyte. So Marchantia is true. Second statement, Pogonatum. Pogonatum is an example for a moss. So it will also have a photosynthetic gametophyte. So that is true. Third statement, Nephrolepis. Nephrolepis is an example for a fern. a seedless plant. And this plant will also have a photosynthetic gametophyte. Fourth statement, pinus. And fifth statement, cycas. Now both cycas and pinus are seed-bearing plants and are gymnosperms. You know that these are higher plants, and these plants do not have a photosynthetic gametophyte. So pinus and cycas are going to be false. Now let's have a look at the third characteristic, which is seedless. We now know the examples for seedless plants according to the diagram. Seedless plants are of two types, lycophytes and pterophytes. Lycophytes include Selaginella and Lycopodium, while pterophytes include ferns or Nephrolepis. Now if we go through the third responses in all five statements, we have in the first statement, Selaginella. Selaginella is a seedless plant, so it is true. Second statement, cycas. Cycas is not a seedless plant. In fact, it produces seeds and they produce naked seeds. Third statement, Lycopodium, that is true. Fourth statement, Nephrolepis, true. Fifth statement, Markantia. Now, Markantia is an example for a liverbird, a non-vascular plant. Still, these plants do not produce seeds, so Markantia is also going to be true. The fourth characteristic is thalloid gametophyte. Now, thalloid gametophyte is a gametophyte where the body is not differentiated into stem, roots and leaves. Usually, thalloid bodies are present in non-vascular plants because they are the most primitive plants like liverbirds and mosses. Now, if you go through the last responses in all five statements, statement 1 says Pogonatum. Now, we might think Pogonatum has a thalloid gametophyte because it is a non-vascular primitive plant, but Pogonatum has a gametophyte which is partly differentiated into a rhizome and rhizoids. So, Pogonatum does not have a thalloid gametophyte. Second statement, Nephrolepis. Nephrolepis is an example for a fern, a seedless plant, and it does not have a thalloid gametophyte. Third statement, Markantia. Now, Markantia is an example for a liverbird, which is a non-vascular plant, and it has a thalloid gametophyte. So, Markantia is true. Fourth statement also says Markantia. The fifth statement says Nephrolepis. We know that Nephrolepis is false and it does not have a thalloid gametophyte. Finally, when we go through all five statements, the statement where all the four responses are going to be true will be statement number 3. So the answer is statement number 3. Question number 8. In the classification of organisms, the taxon phylum was introduced by Carl Versey, Robert Whittaker, Ernest Haeckel, Carolus Linnaeus, Aristotle. Now, Carl Versey is an American microbiologist who discovered the prokaryotic organism group called Archaea. And Robert Whittaker is an American ecologist. He proposed the 5-kingdom classification. Ernest Haeckel is a person who introduced the taxon phylum. So the correct answer will be statement 3, Ernest Haeckel. In addition, the Carolus Linnaeus is a person who introduced the binomial nomenclature of classifying organisms. Question number 9. 2 phyla that include organisms having glycogen as the main stored food. Now, glycogen is the main stored food in animals as well as in fungi. Let's have a look at the 5 statements. Statement 1, Chytridiomycota and Lycophyta. Now, Chytridiomycota is a fungus, so the main stored food is going to be glycogen. That is true. But Lycophyta is an example for a seedless plant. We know that plants store food in the form of starch, not as glycogen. So the first statement is going to be false. Second statement, Zygomycota and Pterophyta. Zygomycota is again a class of fungi, so they are going to store glycogen. Pterophyta is false because Pterophyta is a type of a seedless plant, so they are also going to store food in the form of starch. So second statement is false. Third statement, chordata and chrysophyta. Chordata belong to kingdom Animalia. So animals are also going to store food as glycogen. So chordata is true, but chrysophyta are group of algae. And these chrysophytes are going to store food in the form of oils and a polysaccharide called laminarin. So statement 3 is false. Statement 4, Cycadophyta and Phaeophyta. Cycadophyta are cycads. Now the cycads are seed-bearing plants and are gymnosperms. So they are also going to store food in the form of starch. So Cycadophyta is false. Phaeophyta are a group of algae, and phaeophytes are going to store food in the form of laminarin, which is a polysaccharide. Statement 5, Basidiomycota and Ascomycota. Both these two are two different classes of fungi. So both of these two organisms are going to store food in the form of glycogen. So out of these 5 statements, the correct statement is going to be statement number 5. Question number 10. A student observed an animal with one pair of antennae and one pair of appendages in each segment of the body. This animal belongs to class Crustacea, Chilopoda, Diplopoda, Insecta and Arachnida. Let's go through each of these classes of animals. Crustaceans have 2 pairs of antennae, and their body will be divided into 2 parts, head and the trunk. The head has 3 pairs of appendages in addition to the 2 pairs of antennae, and the trunk will be usually divided into thorax and abdomen. So crustacea is not going to be the answer for this question. Then second statement is Chilopoda. Now Chilopoda have one pair of antennae in their head, and their body will be divided into many segments, and each segment will contain one pair of appendages. So Chilopoda seems like the animal that the student has observed. Third statement, Diplopoda. Now Diplopoda also has one pair of antennae, which is shorter than the antennae that is found in chilopods. And in diplopods also, the body is divided into many segments, but each of these segments will contain 2 pairs of appendages. So Diplopoda is not the answer for this question because the question says one pair of appendages in each segment, while diplopods have 2 pairs of appendages in each segment. Fourth statement, Insecta. Now Insecta also have one pair of antennae, and their body is divided into 3 parts, the head, thorax and the abdomen. And they also have one pair of appendages arising from each part of the body. Now you might think that Insecta is the correct answer for this question, but if you carefully read the question is saying that the appendages arise from each segment in the body. But if you consider Insecta, their body is not divided into segments. Their body is merely divided into 3 parts, head, thorax and the abdomen, and their thorax can be divided into 3 segments, pro, meso and metathorax. So Insecta is not the answer because their appendages do not arise from segments. And statement 5, Arachnida. Now, Arachnida do not have any antennae, and their body has divided into 2 parts, and the entire body is going to contain 8 legs. So out of all these 5 statements, the correct answer is statement number 2, Chilopoda. Question number 11. Anemia is a deficiency syndrome of which of the following vitamins? Let's see what anemia is. Anemia is a reduction in the hemoglobin level below the normal accepted value that depends on a person's age and sex. Anemia can occur as a result of either decreased red blood cell production or increased red blood cell destruction. Decreased red blood cell production can occur as a result of deficiency of vitamins that are essential for red blood cell production. The essential vitamins that are required for red blood cell production would be vitamin B6, vitamin B12, folic acid, vitamin C, and vitamin E. If you go through all these 5 statements, the statement that gives us the essential vitamins that are required for red blood cell production would be statement number 2, which says vitamin B12, B6, and folic acid. Question number 12. Which of the following statements regarding the respiratory system of man is correct? Statement number 1 says, contraction of external intercostal muscles results in inspiration. Now there are 2 main muscles involved in inspiration, the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. So statement 1 is true. Statement number 2, tracheal cavity is lined with columnar epithelium. We know that the trachea is lined by pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium and not with just simple columnar epithelium. So statement number 2 is false. Statement number 3, right lung consists of 2 lobes. Now, this statement is also false because the right lung consists of 3 lobes and the left lung consists of 2 lobes. Statement number 4, exchange of respiratory gases in the lung requires energy. The exchange of respiratory gases occur between the alveolar membrane in the lung and the endothelium of the alveolar capillaries. And gases diffuse across the basement membranes of these 2 epithelial linings by simple diffusion, which is a passive process that does not require energy. So statement number 4 is false. Statement number 5, larynx is located at the level of 2nd and 3rd cervical vertebrae. This statement is false because the larynx is located between the 3rd and 6th cervical vertebrae. Now out of the 5 statements, the correct answer is statement number 1. Question number 13. Select the incorrect statement regarding human blood. Statement 1 says that it is a specialized connective tissue. This is true. Blood is in fact a specialized connective tissue that is present in the form of a liquid. Statement number 2, a mature erythrocyte lacks both nucleus and mitochondria. This statement is true. Mature red blood cells do not contain nuclei and mitochondria. This is to provide enough space to contain the maximum amount of hemoglobin so that the red blood cell can transport the maximum amount of oxygen to the tissues. In addition, red blood cells lack mitochondria to prevent the utilization of oxygen within the red blood cells. Statement number 3. Neutrophils and monocytes are leukocytes showing phagocytosis. This statement is true. We know that leukocytes or white blood cells are of 2 types, granulocytes and agranulocytes. Granulocytes are the neutrophils, eosinophils and basophils. Agranulocytes are the monocytes and lymphocytes. Out of all these white blood cells, neutrophils and monocytes will act as phagocytic cells. They are involved in phagocytosing any foreign body or bacteria that is present in the body. Neutrophils act as phagocytic cells in the circulation where they engulf any foreign body or bacteria that is present in the blood. While monocytes can enter the tissues and become macrophages. And there, the macrophages can then phagocytose any foreign body or bacteria that is present in the tissues. Statement number 4. Most of the carbon dioxide is transported in combination with hemoglobin. This statement is false because most of the carbon dioxide will be transported as bicarbonate ions dissolved in the plasma. If you go through this diagram, you can see that the carbon dioxide that is produced in the tissues as a result of cell metabolism is going to enter the red blood cell. And within the red blood cell, this carbon dioxide is going to bind to a molecule of water to produce carbonic acid. And this reaction will be catalyzed by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase that is present within the red blood cell. And then the carbonic acid is going to dissociate into H plus ions and bicarbonate ions. H plus ions will be accepted by hemoglobin, while bicarbonate ions will enter the plasma in exchange for chloride ions. When this red blood cell enter into the pulmonary capillary, bicarbonate ions will enter the red blood cell again in exchange for chloride, and this bicarbonate ion will again combine with H plus ions released from hemoglobin to produce carbonic acid. And the same enzyme carbonic anhydrase is going to convert carbonic acid into carbon dioxide and water. And then this carbon dioxide is going to diffuse into the alveolus and will be expelled out of the body through expiration. This is the main mechanism in which carbon dioxide is transported, which is as bicarbonate ions dissolved in the plasma. Statement number 5, it helps to regulate the body temperature. We know that one of the functions of blood is to regulate the body temperature, and this statement is true. So out of all these 5 statements, the incorrect statement will be statement number 4. Question number 14, which of the following is not a part of the conducting system of human heart? Chordae tendineae, atrioventricular node, bundle of His, sino-auricular node, and Purkinje fibers. Let us first go through the conducting system of the heart. As shown in this diagram, the conducting system of the heart consists of the sinoatrial node that is present in the wall of the right atrium near the opening of the superior vena cava. Sinoatrial node or the SA node is also known as the pacemaker of the heart, and it can generate spontaneous electrical impulses which will travel through both the atria and will converge into the atrioventricular node, which is present in the lowermost part of the interatrial septum near the opening of the coronary sinus. Then with a short delay, the atrioventricular node will also send impulses through the bundle of His that runs through the interventricular septum and then divide into right and left bundle branches. And each of this bundle branch is going to divide into large number of small branches called Purkinje fibers that will innervate the thick walls of the ventricles. Now, by looking at the 5 responses in this question, you can see that the structure that is not involved in forming the conducting system of the heart is chordae tendineae, and the answer is statement number 1. Question number 15. Which of the following processes in plants increases in the absence of light? Absorption of minerals, absorption of water, ascent of sap, elongation of internodes, and guttation. Let's first see how water is absorbed in plants. Water is absorbed both actively as well as passively through the root hair cells in the plants. And this absorbed water will then move from one cell to another until it reaches the root cortex by osmosis. Then this absorbed water enters into the xylem vessels and will be transported along the xylem vessels upwards to reach the xylem vessels in the leaves. And this upward movement of a continuous column of water along the xylem vessels will be facilitated by the transpiration pull. Now, transpiration is a process where water leaves the plants through exposed parts of the plant, mainly through the leaves and to a lesser extent through the stem as well. And this water leaves the plants through openings called stomata, which are mainly present on the undersurface of the leaves. During daytime, when there is enough sunlight, the transpiration rate is going to increase. And if the transpiration rate is increased, this is also going to increase the upward pull that is exerted by transpiration. This transpiration pull is going to increase the water absorption through the roots. And minerals are also absorbed by the plant roots as inorganic ions dissolved in water. So both water and mineral absorption occurs mainly during the daytime when light is present, aided by the transpiration pull. So absorption of water and minerals will not increase in the absence of light. Therefore, statement number 1 and 2 are incorrect. Then the ascent of sap is the upward movement of water occurring from the roots up to the higher parts of the plant along the xylem vessels. And here also the continuous column of water along the xylem vessels is transported aided by the transpiration pull. Therefore, ascent of sap will not increase in the absence of light. And statement number 3 is also going to be false. Number 4, elongation of internodes. Now, internodes are the regions between two nodes that is present in the stem of a plant. And elongation of internodes occur as a result of increased cell division and cell elongation, which will require plant growth factors. So this is a process that depends on plant growth factors. Therefore, we cannot say whether this process increase or decrease in the absence of light. Number 5, guttation. Now, guttation is the loss of water that occurs from the plant leaves in the form of droplets. And here, water droplets are going to move out of the leaves through small pores called hydatodes. Guttation is a process that occurs due to increased root pressure. During the night time, when transpiration does not occur, the water absorption through the roots of the plant will no longer be facilitated by the transpiration pull. So as a result, water is going to accumulate within the roots, increasing the pressure within the roots. And this build-up of pressure within the roots is going to push the water along the xylem vessels towards the leaves, and this water will then move out of the leaves as droplets through hydatodes. Since guttation is a process that occurs due to increased root pressure and decreased transpiration pull, this process is going to increase in the absence of light. So the correct answer is going to be number 5, guttation. Question number 16. Which of the following is incorrect regarding phloem transport? Now, before going through the statements, let's have a look at what happens during phloem translocation. As you can see here in this diagram, the phloem translocation occurs along sieve tubes, which are long tubes formed from sieve tube elements connected end to end. The cell walls between two sieve tube elements contain pores to allow communication of substances between the sieve tube elements. And each of these sieve tube elements will be closely associated with a companion cell. Now, phloem translocation occurs along the sieve tubes from the source end to the sink end. Source end is the place where the sucrose, that is the major substance that is transported in the phloem tissue, is loaded into the sieve tubes. And the sink end is the place where this loaded sucrose is taken out of the sieve tubes. And this loading and unloading of sucrose into and out of the sieve tubes requires ATP, and therefore this is an active process carried out by the companion cells. During phloem translocation, at the source end, sucrose will be loaded into the sieve tubes by the companion cell. And because sucrose is an osmotically active substance, it is going to absorb water from the adjacent xylem vessels into the sieve tubes. This is going to increase the pressure within the sieve tubes at the source end. So therefore, along the pressure gradient, this sucrose and the water solution is going to flow towards the sink end. At the sink end, the companion cell is going to unload sucrose from the sieve tubes, and water will also leave the sieve tubes at the sink end and again enters into the xylem vessels. So this is how phloem translocation occurs. Now let's have a look at the 5 statements. Statement number 1. Translocation of the phloem sap from leaves to roots takes place through apoplast of sieve tube elements. Now, apoplast is a pathway of water movement that occurs from cell wall to cell wall. But in phloem translocation, sucrose is transported through the sieve tube elements, not along the cell walls. So, first statement is false. Statement number 2. Mature leaves are the major sugar sources in phloem transport. Now, this statement is true, because mature leaves can photosynthesize and can produce 6-carbon sugars. And sucrose is produced in the leaves, and this produced sucrose will be then transported into the sieve tubes. So, mature leaves will become the source end. Statement number 3. Developing root apices and shoot apices are usually sugar sinks in plants. We know that the sink end is a place where sucrose is unloaded from the sieve tubes in order to either be utilized or to be stored. And the developing root and shoot apices require energy sources for their growth. And therefore these places can act as the sink end and can gain this sucrose that is transported along the phloem tissue. Statement number 4. Phloem loading and unloading are active processes. We said that they are in fact active processes, and these are carried out by the companion cells. Statement number 5. Translocation of phloem sap from one sieve tube element to the next is a passive process. Now we know that the phloem translocation along the sieve tubes occur along a pressure gradient from the source end to the sink end. So translocation of phloem sap from one sieve tube element to the next is a passive process, and this statement is true. So in this question, the incorrect statement will be statement number 1. Question number 17. Select the incorrect statement regarding human growth hormone. Number 1. It is synthesized and released by the anterior pituitary. Let's first have a look at all the hormones that are secreted from the anterior pituitary. Now in this diagram, you can see that the anterior pituitary is secreting a number of hormones. And the secretion of these hormones are under the control of the hypothalamus that is located above the pituitary gland. The human growth hormone, it is synthesized and released by the anterior pituitary. So now we can say that this statement is true. Second statement, its release can be either increased or reduced by the hypothalamus. We have already discussed that the hormones that are secreted from the anterior pituitary are under the regulation of the hypothalamus. So therefore, growth hormone is also will be regulated by the hypothalamus, and therefore the second statement is also true. Statement number 3. It increases blood glucose level. Now what are the hormones that increase the blood glucose level, and what are the hormones that decrease the blood glucose level? As you can see here, there are 4 hormones that increase the blood glucose level, and they would be glucagon, cortisol, growth hormone, and adrenaline. And growth hormone is one of those hormones that increase the blood glucose level. Then what are the hormones that decrease the blood glucose level? There's only one hormone that decreases the blood glucose level, that is insulin. So the third statement will be true. Fourth statement, it increases synthesis of fats. Now we know that the growth hormone increases blood glucose levels. So in order to increase the blood glucose levels, this hormone will break down fats and will convert this fat into glucose. So it will not synthesize fats, instead it's going to break down fats. So the statement 4 is going to be false. Statement 5, it regulates the metabolism of liver. Now, unlike other hormones, growth hormone does not have one specific organ that it will act on. But instead, the growth hormone is going to act on all of our body tissues and increase the tissue growth. So similarly, growth hormone is also going to act on the liver and regulate the metabolic processes that are occurring within the liver. So the statement 5 is also going to be true. And now in this question, the incorrect statement is going to be statement number 4. Question number 18. Select the incorrect statement regarding human brain. Number 1. Functional area concerned with speech is located in the frontal lobe. If you look at this diagram, the first diagram will show you the 4 main lobes in the cerebrum. They are the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe and temporal lobe. The next diagram will show you the 2 areas involved with speech. You have the anterior Broca's area, that is in the frontal lobe, and the posterior Wernicke's area, that is in the temporal lobe. The Broca's area is involved in the production of speech or communicating our thoughts, while the posterior Wernicke's area is involved in language comprehension. That is to understand the language or to understand what is said. Coming back to our first statement, functional area concerned with speech is located in the frontal lobe. Since one of these areas is located in the frontal lobe, we can take this statement as true. Statement number 2, corpus callosum connects the 2 hemispheres of the cerebrum. The statement is true. Corpus callosum is the structure that connects the 2 cerebral hemispheres. Now in this diagram you can see how the corpus callosum looks like in 2 different cross sections of the brain. Statement number 3, cerebellum plays an important role in maintaining balance and equilibrium. This statement is true. The main functions of the cerebellum would be to maintain the balance and the posture, coordination of movement and cognition, that is the ability to acquire knowledge and skills. Number 4, thalamus is involved in the integration of sensory information. We know that the main function of the thalamus is to integrate all the sensory information except those coming from the olfactory nerves. Fifth statement, reflex center for coughing is located in the pons varoli. Now, any reflex arc consists of afferent nerves, a coordination center and efferent nerves. This diagram will show you the cough reflex very briefly. When the respiratory mucous membrane gets irritated by various stimuli, impulses will be generated in the respiratory mucosa and these impulses will travel through the vagal nerves to the cough center, that is in the medulla oblongata. And from the medulla oblongata, now the efferent impulses are going to come through the motor nerves that supply the respiratory muscles and the laryngeal muscles. And the effect is going to be a cough response. So the fifth statement saying that the reflex center for coughing is located in the pons varoli is false. It is actually located in the medulla oblongata. And in this question, the incorrect statement will be statement number 5. Question number 19. Select the incorrect statement regarding an action potential of a human motor neuron. Statement number 1. Immediately after one action potential, a second action potential cannot be produced. Now this statement is true. This is because after the initiation of an action potential, as you can see here in this diagram, there's going to be a refractory period during which another action potential cannot be produced. Now there are 2 types of refractory periods, absolute refractory period and the relative refractory period. During the absolute refractory period, action potential will not be produced no matter how strong the stimulus is. But during relative refractory period, Only the stimuli with very high intensities can produce an action potential. Now, the reason why there is a refractory period after the initiation of an action potential is to prevent the formation of another action potential immediately after the formation of one action potential, and this will prevent the reverse conduction of the impulse along the axon. Statement number 2. It is generated only at the nodes of Ranvier. As you can see here in this diagram, in myelinated neurons, most of the axon membrane will be covered by the myelin sheath, and the myelin sheath will be exposed to the extracellular fluid only at places called nodes of Ranvier. And these myelin sheaths act as insulating membranes so that action potentials are not produced or impulses will not be propagated at the places where the axon is covered by the myelin sheath. So therefore, action potentials will be initiated only along the nodes of Ranvier. In addition, all the voltage gated channels are also concentrated at these places called nodes of Ranvier. Therefore, action potentials will be generated only at the nodes of Ranvier in myelinated neurons. So therefore, statement number 2 is correct. Statement number 3. Its depolarization phase is immediately followed by the hyperpolarization phase. If you go through this diagram, you can see that a sufficiently large stimulus can produce an action potential. And an action potential consists of 3 phases. They are the depolarization phase, repolarization phase, and the hyperpolarization phase. During depolarization phase, sodium ions move into the cell. And during repolarization phase, potassium ions are going to move out of the cell. And the hyperpolarization phase occurs due to delayed closure of potassium channels, resulting in excess movements of potassium ions out of the cell. If you come back to our initial statement, it says that the depolarization phase is immediately followed by the hyperpolarization phase. Now we can say that this statement is false because depolarization is followed by repolarization phase, and the repolarization phase only will be followed by the hyperpolarization phase. So statement 3 is false. Statement number 4. Its duration is about 2 milliseconds. This is true. The duration of an action potential is about 2 milliseconds. Statement number 5. A threshold stimulus is essential to produce it. Now, only sufficiently large stimulus whose intensity reaches the threshold level will produce an action potential, and any stimulus with an intensity less than the threshold level will not generate an action potential. So, a threshold stimulus is in fact essential to produce an action potential, and statement number 5 is true. So, the incorrect statement in this question will be statement number 3. Question number 20. Select the incorrect statement regarding excretion. Statement number 1. If excretion does not occur, blood pH may change. Now, what do you mean by excretion? Excretion is a process in which the unwanted and toxic byproducts that are produced within the cell during cellular metabolic processes will be removed from the body. And what are the examples for excretory products? They will be carbon dioxide, ammonia, urea, and uric acid. We know that carbon dioxide is produced in all the cells that carry out aerobic respiration as a byproduct of respiration. So carbon dioxide will be an excretory product, and ammonia will be produced in cells as a byproduct of breakdown of nitrogenous compounds like proteins and nucleic acids, and this ammonia can be converted into urea and uric acid within the cells. So therefore, carbon dioxide, ammonia, urea, uric acid are considered as excretory products. What happens if these excretory products are not removed? They are going to accumulate within the cells and also in the circulation. If carbon dioxide accumulates, it will result in an acidosis. because carbon dioxide is an acidic gas. It can dissolve in water to produce carbonic acid, and this carbonic acid can dissociate, releasing H plus ions to the circulation. And if ammonia gets accumulated, it will result in an alkalosis, because ammonia is a basic compound. So you can see here the obvious result of accumulation of these excretory byproducts would be change in the blood pH. So this will take us back to our first statement. They are asking if excretion does not occur, blood pH may change. So this statement will be correct. Statement number 2, defecation is a form of excretion. Now we know that excretory products are formed within the cells as a byproduct of cellular metabolism. But feces are not produced within the cells, they are produced within the gut lumen, and they consist of the unwanted and undigested food materials after the absorption of all the nutrients in the food. So feces are not excretory products, and therefore defecation is not a form of excretion, and therefore statement number 2 is incorrect. Statement number 3, bile pigments are an excretory product of man. Now bile pigments or bilirubin is formed as a result of breakdown of hemoglobin within the cells of the reticuloendothelial system, such as macrophages. Within the macrophages, hemoglobin will be broken down into heme and globin, and this heme part of hemoglobin is going to further convert into different products like biliverdin and finally bilirubin. So bilirubin or bile pigments are a byproduct of a metabolic process that occurs within cells, and therefore bile pigments are excretory products, and the third statement is therefore true. Statement number 4, carbon loss is highest when uric acid is produced as nitrogenous excretory product. Now the first nitrogenous excretory product that is formed in any organism will be ammonia, and this ammonia will be then converted into urea or uric acid. We know that ammonia does not contain any carbon, so excretion of ammonia is not going to result in any kind of carbon loss. If we consider urea, now one molecule of urea contains one carbon atom. So excretion of urea as an excretory product is going to result in some kind of a carbon loss. But if we consider uric acid, one molecule of uric acid will contain 5 carbon atoms. So if we excrete uric acid, the carbon loss is going to be even more higher. Therefore, out of all the nitrogenous excretory products like ammonia, urea and uric acid, the carbon loss will be highest when uric acid is produced as a nitrogenous excretory product, and therefore the statement number 4 is correct. Statement number 5, production of ammonia as an excretory product does not require energy. This statement is in fact correct. We know that the initial nitrogenous excretory product that is produced in any organism will be ammonia, and the formation of this ammonia will not require any energy. But in some animals, ammonia will be converted to urea or uric acid, or sometimes both, and this conversion of ammonia to urea or uric acid will require energy. And therefore, production of ammonia as an excretory product will not require energy, and our fifth statement will be true. So the incorrect statement in question number 20 will be the second statement. Question number 21. Which of the following statements is incorrect regarding smooth muscles? Statement 1. They show the ability to return to original length after being stretched. Now, this ability to return to its original length after being stretched is elasticity, and this is a property of smooth muscles. Therefore, this statement is true. Now, let's go to the second statement. Adrenaline causes contractions in some smooth muscles and relaxation in others. Now, adrenaline will act on the smooth muscles in the arteriolar walls and will cause contraction of these muscles. And the contraction of these smooth muscles in the arteriolar walls is going to narrow the lumen of the arterioles and increase the pressure within the lumen. This will result in increase in the peripheral resistance and finally leading to increased blood pressure. And this is how the blood pressure is elevated during sympathetic stimulation when adrenaline is released. And the same hormone adrenaline will act on the smooth muscles in the bronchial walls and cause the relaxation of smooth muscles in these bronchial walls, and this will result in bronchodilation or increase in the lumen of the bronchioles and the airways so that more air can enter the lungs. In addition, adrenaline will also cause relaxation of smooth muscles in the wall of the gut, resulting in reduced peristaltic movements and reduced food conduction within the gastrointestinal tract. Now coming back to our second statement, adrenaline causes contractions in some smooth muscles and relaxation in others. So this statement is true because adrenaline will cause contraction of smooth muscles in the arterial walls and relaxation of smooth muscles in the walls of the airways and also in the wall of the GI tract. Statement number 3, some show rhythmic contractions. Now the smooth muscles in the wall of the GI tract will show these kind of peristaltic movements which are rhythmic contractions of the wall of the GI tract. So therefore statement number 3 is correct. Statement number 4, they fatigue rapidly. We know that it's the skeletal muscles that contract rapidly and also gets fatigued rapidly. But smooth muscles will contract slowly and also gets fatigued slowly. Therefore, statement 4 is false. Statement 5, they are innervated by the autonomic nervous system. So the smooth muscles are involuntary muscles and involuntary muscles will be innervated by the autonomic nervous system. But if you consider skeletal muscles being voluntary muscles will be innervated by the somatic motor nerves. So the statement saying that the smooth muscles are innervated by the autonomic nervous system will be correct. So out of all these 5 statements, the incorrect statement will be the 4th statement. Question number 22. Which of the following is incorrect regarding skeletal muscle? Number 1. Normally, acetylcholine is necessary to initiate its contraction. The statement is true. Now in this diagram you can see that when an action potential arrives at the neuromuscular junction, acetylcholine is going to be released at the neuromuscular junction, and then this acetylcholine will act on its receptors present on the muscle plate in order for the action potential to be generated in the skeletal muscle and to stimulate the skeletal muscle contraction. So binding of acetylcholine to the muscle plate at the neuromuscular junction is essential to initiate the contraction of the skeletal muscle. Statement number 2. During its contraction, the length of A bands and I bands remain constant. Now let's have a look at what happens to the sarcomere before and after muscle contraction. In this diagram, the thin blue color lines will represent the thin filaments while the red color lines represent the thick filaments. During muscle contraction, the thin filaments slide over the thick filaments. So that after the muscle contraction, the length of the I band that contains only the thin filaments is going to reduce. But the length of the A band that contains both thick and thin filaments is going to be same. So in this second statement, the length of the A bands remain constant, but the length of the I bands will not remain constant. So therefore this statement is false. Number 3, series of power strokes occurs during its contraction. Now this statement is true. It's because of these power strokes that the thin filaments slide over the thick filaments. Statement number 4, Without ATP and calcium ions, it cannot contract. This is true. Both calcium ions as well as ATP will be required for the generation of these power strokes, so that thin filaments will slide over the thick filaments and the muscle contract. Here in the skeletal muscle, this calcium will be released from the smooth endoplasmic reticulum or the sarcoplasmic reticulum present in the skeletal muscle fiber, and ATP will be produced by the many mitochondria that is present in the muscle fiber. Statement number 5. During its contraction, the length between two Z lines shortens. Now, the length between these two lines is going to be equal to the length of the sarcomere. We know that the length of the sarcomere is going to shorten during muscle contraction. So, therefore, this statement is also true. So, in question number 22, the incorrect statement will be the statement number 2. Question number 23. Select the incorrect statement regarding human scapula. Number 1. It is a flat triangular shaped bone. In this diagram, you can see the scapula and the upper part of the bone humerus and how they articulate with each other. So you can see here the scapula is a triangular shaped flat bone. So the statement number 1 will be true. Statement number 2, its posterior surface is rough. Now the posterior surface of the bone scapula gives attachment to many muscles. So therefore the posterior surface is rough. So statement number 2 is true. Number 3, its acromion process articulates with the clavicle. You can see here in this diagram I have circled where the acromion process articulates with the lateral end of the clavicle. So this statement is also true. Number 4, its glenoid cavity lies in the medial border. If you go through this diagram again, you can see here where the glenoid cavity is located. Now, the glenoid cavity of the scapula articulates with the head of the humerus. Now, the humerus lies lateral to the scapula. So, the glenoid cavity also has to lie at the lateral border of the scapula, not at the medial border. So, therefore, this statement is false. Statement number 5. Coracoid process is a projection arising from its upper border. Again, if you go through this diagram, here the red color arrow shows you where the coracoid process is. So, this is a process that arises from the upper border of the scapula, and therefore this statement is also true. So, out of all the 5 statements, the incorrect statement will be number 4. Question number 24. Select the incorrect statement regarding lower limb of man. Number 1. Femur is a long bone located parallel to the midline of the body. This diagram shows you where and how this long bone, femur, is located in the human body. As you can see here, the femur lies at a slight angle to the midline of the body. So it does not lie exactly parallel to the midline of the body, and therefore the first statement is false. Statement number 2. Tibia is the second longest bone in the lower limb. This statement is true. Femur is the longest bone in the human body and also in the lower limb, and tibia will be the second longest bone in the lower limb. Statement number 3. It consists of 30 bones. This is also true. Both the lower limb as well as the upper limb will consist of 30 bones. Statement number 4. Fibula is not a part of the knee joint. In this diagram, you can see how the knee joint is formed. There are 3 bones involved in forming the knee joint. The knee joint is formed by the distal end of the femur, the proximal end of the tibia, and the small bone patella. And the fibula is not involved in forming the knee joint. You can see here the fibula is going to articulate only with the lateral part of the proximal end of the tibia. So this statement number 4 saying that fibula is not a part of the knee joint is true. Number 5. Foot has both longitudinal and transverse arches. This statement is in fact true. Foot has 2 longitudinal arches, medial and lateral longitudinal arches, and the transverse arch. So out of the 5 statements, the incorrect statement will be the first one. Question number 25. Select the incorrect statement regarding reproduction of human males. Number 1. Testosterone acts on all parts of the reproductive system. Now this statement is true. Testosterone is a main hormone related to the reproductive system of males, and it is produced by the Leydig cells of the testes in response to the hormone called LH or luteinizing hormone. Statement number 2. Seminal vesicular secretion contains glucose and vitamin C. Now, vitamin C will be found in the seminal vesicular secretions but not glucose. Instead, what is found in the seminal vesicular secretion will be fructose. So, this statement will be false. Number 3. Capacitation of sperms occurs in the female genital tract. Now, what is capacitation? This is a physiological maturation process of the spermatozoa that occurs in the female genital tract, where these spermatozoa gains the ability to penetrate and fertilize the ovum. So, therefore, statement number 3 is true. Number 4. Duration of spermatogenesis is about 72 days. This statement is also true. Spermatogenesis is the production of sperms in the seminiferous tubules of the testes, and it takes about 72 days for this process to occur. Number 5. Sertoli cell functions as an endocrine structure. This is also true. Sertoli cells are present in the seminiferous tubules of the testes, and they secrete a hormone called inhibin that inhibits the hormone FSH. So out of the 5 statements, the incorrect statement will be statement number 2. So this ends the discussion of the first 25 MCQs in the A-Level 2016 biology paper. And I thank you all for listening to this discussion, and I wish all of you all good luck for your exams.